Welcome to Booktopia. I'm Joel, and I'm here with Josh Widdicombe to talk about his book, Watching Neighbours
Hello.
Twice a Day. Thanks so much for joining us, Josh.
I'm genuinely delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Talking to a real-life neighbour. No, not a real-life neighbour. An Australian, at least.
You got me excited then. But, you know, I'll be honest with you. And I imagine you're aware that I do work with an Australian quite regularly, Adam Hills. But really,
Yes.
Australia for me does mean neighbours. That's the sad truth of that. And I think, you know, throughout the period when I was growing up in the UK, that was our two exposures to Australian culture were losing cricket matches and watching Neighbours. And I think I preferred watching Neighbours.
Yeah, that's not unusual. The weird thing I think about the neighbours phenomenon in the UK is that I think Brits have a much higher value on it than Australians do. It's nowhere near the same phenomenon here.
No, exactly. So that was one of the things that you'd hear. So because obviously Neighbours was on in the UK and it was a big deal when I was a kid. It's not as big a deal now, I don't think, but it was a huge deal when I was a kid. And various things you'd hear, like, because obviously there's rumors of, and one of the things was that they don't even watch it in Australia and they only keep making it because it's so popular in England and Britain. I don't know if that was true, but we went to we filmed in Australia. We did a last leg travelogue in Australia, and I met Ian Smith that plays Harold Bishop and Alan Fletcher that plays Carl Kennedy. To me, that was like meeting, you know, Paul McCartney and John Lennon. But we went out for dinner with them or whatever. I was like, why aren't people swarming around them? What's going on here? This is Harold Bishop. Come on.
Yeah, it's definitely not the same. So I said earlier, my partner is British. When I met her, she had only relatively recently come to Australia, and she still had this idea in her head that what she was just basically in an episode of Neighbours. Not true. It took her a while to realize that we actually read books and stuff.
Yeah, apparently so, but we don't like to focus on that. No. Yeah, well, I obviously I do for this, but yeah, it's weird. Like if anyone ever goes to Australia, if anyone goes to Australia, the question within 30 seconds is, did you go to Ramsay Street? That's genuinely, I'm sorry to say, but to people in England and Britain, that is by a distance your main point of interest. That is your houses and park. That's your Buckingham Palace, basically.
And you know what? I'm fine with it, especially. I think you've opened up a vein of culture here in this book. So to briefly explain, the premise of your book is a sort of a memoir, but it's interspersed. Each chapter begins with a different 90s TV show. And I feel like you've opened a sort of vein of culture that we have not previously been willing to bleed out, you know? And you've sort of intellectualized it without really intellectualizing it, if you know what I mean. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think so. I think I basically wanted to write about, I didn't want to write a standard memoir because I think I speak for the world when I say the world doesn't need a standard Josh Widdicombe memoir. But I was always interested in 90s culture and the culture of the time I grew up. And I wanted to kind of tell the story of growing up being obsessed with culture, like TV and music and all that kind of stuff growing up, sport. And I thought the best way to do that was just by television was so central to my life because I grew up in the middle of nowhere. Now, when I talk to people in Britain about growing up in the middle of nowhere, it sounds like I grew up in the middle of nowhere, but I've been to Australia and I didn't really grow up in the middle of nowhere compared to some of you guys. Do you know what I mean? But relatively, there was 4 kids in my year at school, and we grew up in a village with just a post office, and it was pretty remote. And I wasn't really into outward boundy stuff, so I just I just became obsessed with watching television and absorbing it and absorbing the world through that. So I thought it was kind of the best way to tell the story of that decade. And then while I was writing it, I kind of realized that what I was writing about was the last decade where TV was the main thing, where TV was central to our lives before the internet and smartphones kind of meant everyone splintered off and everyone was living in their own world where you're watching your own things and you're watching it on your own time. And it felt like, oh, kind of more by luck than judgment, maybe this is a book about that last kind of decade when television was like a member of the family almost. You know what I mean? It was kind of the fifth person in the corner of the room.
Absolutely. It's like the last decade of the monoculture.
Yeah,
and, I mean,
exactly.
That's sort of quite a weird privilege thing to say, because obviously that wasn't the case. There are lots of different cultures, even in the 90s. But I still, you know, as I think we're probably around the same age, I think it's a really similar feeling. Like at a certain point that ended and everything sort of atomized, and we just everyone has their own thing that they're into. And sure, it's a golden age of television, but we don't all watch the same thing and we don't all share in the same experiences in that way.
No, you can't talk about it now because you go, so when I was 10, to use Neighbours as an example, you'd watch Neighbours and then you'd go into school the next day and you discuss the episode of Neighbours. You'd all sat down and watched at the same time. Now, everyone's watching, you know, whatever, The Last Dance, right? For instance, whatever the Vogue-ish Netflix show is at that time. No one can talk about it because everyone's at different points in it. So actually, it's the one thing you're actively banned from talking about. You can't talk about it because people go, no, don't tell me I'm only on episode 4 and you're on episode 6, so we can't discuss this. So it's actively the opposite of a shared experience now.
Yeah, and it's also, it seems to be the conversations are esoterically about, oh, have you watched this show? It's a little bit like this show.
Yeah.
But you can only watch it on Netflix, or you can only watch it on Stan or whatever the obscure viewing platform you've seen it on.
Yeah.
And everyone just discusses the suggested things that you should watch rather than we've all become an algorithm.
Yeah, totally. And nominally, I'm sure we are, through choice, we're absorbing better quality culture where, you know, we're watching things we actually want to watch. We're never, but what we've lost is that it's no longer the shared experience that it was. And it's fragmented, and, you know, it's not a better or worse time. It's just different. So I'm not claiming we all need to go back to because we don't. There's so many things that are brilliant now that we didn't have then, and I can't live without my mobile phone. I'm not saying that or anything, but I found it very interesting that it felt like that was actually the main difference in culture between when I was a child. And it did mean that you'd sit and you'd watch these TV shows that you would never now watch, and you'd watch them with more concentration than you'd now watch The Crown, because you didn't have a mobile phone, which you'd like, oh, I've just got WhatsApp, I'll just look at that. You know, you're literally watching these. That was all you were doing.
Yeah, it was like watching something subtitled.
Yeah, exactly.
Every show. It was like every show was subtitled.
Yeah. That's totally.
Yeah. British children's television have a lot of very strange characters that I have been exposed to through my partner and just the internet. You talk about Mr. Blobby, and I have come across Bungle,
Bungle, right? Yeah.
Who looks like a serial killer of a bear, if ever there was one. What is wrong with British children's TV characters?
Well, I don't know.
From the 90s, specifically.
Interestingly, you say Bungle. So my wife's mum was worked at Thames, and she invented Zippy, who was Bungle's
right, with a zipper for a mouth. Like, oh, so terrifying.
Yeah, of course.
Objectively.
Yeah. But I just think, you know, they were off the leash, weren't they? They could do whatever they want, I think. I imagine now that, and rightfully so, you know, children's television, there's lots of things that you checks and balances and stuff. You can't say that to children, you know, all that kind of stuff. it felt, I think, you know, I mean, you can only tell from the things like Bungle or stuff. It was pretty Wild West, wasn't it? The children's TV world, I think, in the 90s. Mr. Blobby, I think, isn't a children's TV character in a way. I see Mr. Blobby, I don't know what his cultural impact was in Australia, but like
zero, but it's still very
totally zero.
Yeah, so, I had until I had come across it elsewhere, I had never heard of it. But reading your book, I was familiar with it as soon as I read it, and it was very interesting.
It's a very interesting kind of phenomenon that occurred, that he was basically a character made by Noel Edmonds. Do you have Noel Edmonds in Australia? He's a kind of, he's kind of the king. He's the king of light entertainment, basically, right? For the last 2 decades, maybe. He's brilliant. And 3 decades, maybe 4 decades even. But anyway, it was a character made to prank people. So it was to do kind of, you know, pranks on celebrities, to like punk style pranks. And the character was self-consciously shit. And for some reason, the British people embraced this character as their favorite character for maybe 12 months to 2 years. He was like the Beatles in Britain. And it was just this surreal time where everything was Mr. Blobby. And all sense of the original irony was lost. And he just became what he'd kind of set out to satirize in a way. Do you know what I mean? And and he led to the Mr. Blobby theme park, and he had a #1 single, and it was just this kind of surreal kind of anomaly in British cultural history almost. You know what I mean? Like there's no real parallels that I can draw to it, or it wasn't like, oh, and it just happened and then it stopped happening. It was a really weird kind of parallel world.
And it does feel like that strange embrace of mediocrity or something. You know?
Yeah.
or you know, you're a prisoner of low expectations. I feel like
I think mediocrity is also kind as well.
Yeah,
I think mediocrity is
that was aspirational.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just, I mean, it's a kind of embrace of boneheadedness and like, but what he did do at the start was like, he did prick these celebrities' pomposity in a really fun way, and he was really good and he was really anarchic, and then by the end he was just falling over into a plate of jelly. Do you know what I mean? It's like, but I don't know. Yeah, it's a strange period of kind of British history. And actually you can, I don't think I've mentioned in the book, but you can like go onto the Mr. Blobby, you know, when you go onto like a Wikipedia page or a single or an album, and it's got all the chart positions around the world, and usually it'll be like pretty consistent, so it'll be like 1, 2, 4, 5 across the world. Australia and England, Australia and Britain are often very similar, right?
Yeah.
But Mr. Blobby, it's like #1, and then the next highest is like number 176, which I think even might have been in Australia, actually. Like, I think you might have
possibly.
Yeah. But it literally happened nowhere else. Nowhere.
It is strange. And I think that's one of the things about British TV that I think Australia did import a lot of British TV. So I have a certain level of crossover. But there are certain things that just didn't at all.
Yeah.
And they're completely absent entirely from the culture because it didn't cross over anywhere else. And Australians are a weird sort of amalgam between the US children's TV shows and British children's TV shows, and then our own terrible children's TV shows. And great, but mostly terrible. But it feels like the British sort of TV culture, because of the sort of prominence and of the BBC and longevity, it's sort of built more deeply into the sort of building blocks of the culture. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think certainly. I think TV is, you know, I think the golden age of TV being, and I don't mean golden age as in the best TV we did, but the golden age of TV being central to our lives in Britain was probably the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And growing up, these TV shows were getting, you know, EastEnders would, an average episode of EastEnders would probably get 16 million, right? Which is like a quarter of the country. That's a lot of people are just watching a general episode of EastEnders. And these people were, everything was on TV. Everything you got was through television. And I think maybe Australia, you've got obviously a more outdoorsy life. You've got a better climate. You've got, you know, you're playing that's why you're so much better at sport than us. Probably not one of the main reasons is per person. Do you know what I mean? And so you've got this, there's this different, but from November to February, what else is there to do in Britain? Do you know what I mean? Then watch Gladiators or watch Noel's House Party or watch all these things. And it felt so central to the dialogue of our history, I think, in a way. It felt like also, you know, there's certain things that Britain's been really good at. And I think like pop music, I think you could make an argument that we probably, you know, have a huge influence. You know, the Beatles, the Stones, all the way through, you know, we've had a huge cultural impact on that. But I think television is, we didn't have lots of American imports. We didn't really, we had the odd Australian import. We had Friends, we had Frasier, but our television was very parochial in a way. Do you know what I mean? It didn't feel part of the, now there's, you know, you're watching American stuff all the time. In the 90s, it was starting, and it was starting in the 80s maybe with like Dallas and stuff like that. But like in the 90s, you had the sitcoms, and you had the odd thing like maybe ER or 30 something was it called, or whatever it was. But it wasn't, when I talked to Adam Hills, so about television or culture or whatever, it comes up. His references are so American because he grew up in Australia. And we just didn't have that. And I actually think we actively almost kicked against that, particularly in the 90s. There was this period where, you know, the horrible term of cool Britannia or whatever, but where Britain had this confidence about itself. It had this kind of thing about culture that, you know, it was proud of. And it's no surprise that culture Britain was proud of was nominally a culture that talked about itself. Do you know what I mean? It was music about Britain, music about the British way of life. And I think I don't know, there's something about our psyche that enjoys that parochialism, enjoys that kind of, you know, it's Alan Bennett, it's, you know, it's to Jarvis Cocker, these kind of, that's what we like, I think, is like that. We liked that feeling of being a small island caught in its own eccentricity, I think, to an extent.
Yeah, there's a certain self-consciousness to it, which is, whilst also being uninhibited. I feel like that's the difference between the 90s and subsequent decades of maybe the same type of productions. And it does feel like the 90s is coming back a bit. There's a sense of 90s cool about lots of things, but one of the things that doesn't seem to be coming back is 90s television. And you sort of say in the book, you know, there are sort of seminal periods of television in Britain in the 60s and 70s where people will point to specific shows, whether it's in children's TV or not, and say, you know, this was so pivotal, but people don't really point to shows in the 90s in the same way.
No.
Do you think there is why do you think that is?
I think in a way, there's a kind of feeling that the 90s, you know, for me, something like TFI Friday, which I imagine you didn't have in Australia because it was live.
No, I don't think so.
But for me, that's the best TV show I've ever seen. That I loved it. It was just amazing. It's a brilliant, brilliant live television show. It's just such a kind of tough thing to do. And but I think all of these TV shows in the 90s, I mean, in many ways, I think the things that last the longest are the things that have kind of got a dourness or a darkness or a depth or something. And the 90s feels now very kind of celebratory and very positive and sunny and kind of, you know, it's got this confidence that probably proved misjudged, should we say, in the way life was going and the way life would be. And I feel like it almost feels like this time of strange naivety. So in a way, it doesn't translate as well as maybe, I don't know, some kind of kitchen sink drama from the 70s, which now, you know, that it has a depth to it or something. I feel like a lot of the television that meant the most to me is the stuff that was most kind of not thin, but like just kind of flippant in a way, or kind of disposable. And I don't think any of that travels maybe as well as your heavier television.
Yeah, and all the attempts at being serious and high end seem to have sort of failed in the 90s too. The chapter about Eldorado, which I was not familiar with, but my partner remembers with crystal clarity, was fascinating. I mean, just to start with, the idea that you would film a television show with that bigger budget and have characters speaking in another language and not subtitle it at all. What was going on? What can you tell us a little bit
this kind
about
of surreal
Eldorado for people?
Yeah. So EastEnders was the big BBC, it still is the big BBC soap opera, and they tried to launch a second BBC soap opera, basically from the bloke that had come up with EastEnders, and it not a bad idea at all, really. It was set in Spain. It was going to be a group of expats who are kind of living in this community in Spain, and kind of trapped in that kind of world. And that's a pretty strong premise for a soap opera. And then it was kind of everything that could go wrong did go wrong. So they built this set out of stone, like the town was built out of stone, which meant that all of the sound echoed. So none of the sound was clear in the recordings. They cast people that had never acted before, basically because they were hot. That was the reason they were casting these people. They brought in other European characters because they decided they want to sell this soap across Europe. And these characters spoke in their native tongue in scenes. So you'd have scenes in Danish, and basically it launched. It was the biggest debacle. It launched with 8 million viewers, I think. Within a month, it had 2 million viewers. It was like a disaster. And also when the BBC has a disaster, that's a different thing to a different TV channel that's commercially funded, because people almost take personal offense because their own money has been spent on the license fee. No one cares if ITV launches a soap that doesn't work. Who cares? Who's paying for it? Dolmio or something. But like, if BBC are paying for it, it's like it's like a national problem. It's like when we only got 1 gold medal at the Olympics. It's that kind of national disaster.
Absolutely, that totally makes sense. And it also goes to that you also talk about the BBC, the trust people have in the BBC when you talk about Ghostwatch, which I gotta say, I'm gonna track that down and watch it.
It's online. It's so good.
It sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Can you fill people in on the concept of Ghostwatch? I love this idea.
So this was mad. So this was when I was 10. The BBC for Halloween decided, well, they announced, as far as I was aware, and a lot of people were aware, that they were going to do a live kind of location thing in a haunted house on the night of Halloween, which is a very, nice idea. But what they were kind of foggy about, and it was hosted by Michael Parkinson, who was, the most trusted.
He's definitely famous here too.
Right, so he's made it across. He's made it across. Yeah. So Michael Parkinson, who's like the most famous interviewer and journalist, proper person, and people like Sarah Green, who's a really well-respected children's host, and Craig Charles, who's like an actor and comedian. And everyone just thought they were just hosting this thing. But what it was actually a dramatization of a BBC live broadcast in which it all goes wrong and everything goes wrong, and the ghost starts chasing Sarah Green around, and the things go, and then in the end Michael Parkinson gets possessed by this ghost. But the nation didn't realize of a pedo, called Pipes, right? And the nation didn't realize. And this was before Twitter or anything, obviously. But like, so now everyone would just, because you go on your phone. No one knew. Yeah. And it's just like this just scandal, because the BBC had tricked the nation into thinking that Michael Parkinson had been possessed by a paedophile. Like, basically, it was like this mad. And like most get, all that kind of most complaints ever and all that. But it's kind of got re-embraced in the last decade or so, because I think all of the kids like me have become the people that are like in their 20s and 30s now, who are going, and it's kind of got re-evaluated as this amazing thing, really, like that can't believe it happened. The BBC, just to be clear, they say they didn't, and I think they are honest. They didn't intend to trick people. It was just, but it's nominal how much they. They'd say stuff like
intro,
there's a cast list in the Radio Times. Yeah.
That did not read like something that was really clearly making it obvious this is a drama, not a documentary. It wasn't just 9-year-olds that would have had trouble with that, I'm sure.
No.
Fantastic. I thought that whole section was amazing, and I'm definitely going to track it down. I could talk to you for the rest of the day, but I know you've got lots of stuff to do today. So before you go, I wanted to ask you a neighbour's question, to which I'm probably not going to understand the answer, but I still think it's funny. Which neighbour's character do you think you trust the most with raising your own child?
Oh, wow. You're not going to, Well, I think Susan Kennedy.
I do know Susan Kennedy.
Yeah. I think she was a very good mum to Libby and Billy and Mal, so I'd go with her. But obviously, Dr. Carl, you get in that bargain, who is a bit more of a wild card. I think Helen Daniels did a very good job. I think, I think I'd go with Helen Daniels.
It's a solid answer.
Yeah, thank you.
But I guess. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us, Josh.
An absolute pleasure.
It was great to talk to you. And you can order Josh's book, Watching Neighbours Twice a Day, from Booktopia or from your local bookshop. Thanks so much for joining us.
Cheers, man. Thank you.